Okay, welcome to week 2 in our class on Hosea. We went through the introductory stuff last time, and so we're going to go from chapter 1, according to the syllabus here, all the way up to chapter 2, verse 1. And it's funny how sometimes the chapter demarcations don't quite line up with the subject matters and stuff, and this is one of those books where everything's offset a little bit. The chapters aren't real natural breaks in the subject matter. Anyway, we'll see that here tonight. So again, the reading is the same as last time. So I hope you guys keep up with it, because when you do the reading, I just think it just really helps bring things into context really well. So try and keep up on that. We looked at this issue of the theme of the book, how it jumps from judgment to salvation throughout the book, and we're going to see that here today. So in chapter 1, through the first 9 verses, we see this judgment being pronounced once again on Israel. But then we see in the last part of chapter 1 and through chapter 2, verse 1, this hope that the Lord gives the nation, this salvation or this deliverance that He promises them. And we're gonna look at that deliverance and see what that is based on. Okay, let's look at verse 1 while we read this particular portion, and while you guys see the chart that's on there. We'll just talk about this chart very, very briefly. But chapter 1, verse 1 kind of stands alone, but it's really introductory and gives us kind of a historical setting to the book. We looked at this a little bit last week. It says, "The word of the Lord which came to Hosea, the son of Beeri, during the days of Uzziah, Jotham, Ahaz, and Hezekiah, kings of Judah, and during the days of Jeroboam, the son of Joash, the king of Israel." Okay, and we talked about these kings, and we talked about how the fact that it's kind of interesting that in Hosea here, he names 4 kings of Judah. And it's like, well, wait, I thought Hosea was a prophet to the northern kingdom. Why is he naming 4 kings of Judah? Well, he does that just to give us a time frame, a historical setting for the book, but he also talks about the days of Jeroboam. During the days of Jeroboam, the son of Joash, the king of Israel, the northern kingdom. So he does name one king in the northern kingdom, but it's interesting because Hosea prophesied not just during Jeroboam's term, but also during Zechariah's term, Shallum, Menahem, Pekah, and Hosea. All of those kings in the northern kingdom ruled while Hosea was prophesying. How long did Hosea prophesy? You guys remember that from last week? 30 years. Yeah, close to 40 years. Now, some people say, I was looking at one of the older commentaries, and he spoke about how Hosea prophesied for 90 years. I was like, wow, 90 years, where did he come up with that? And he came up with that from verse 1 here, because where it says that he prophesied during the days of Jeroboam, the son of Joash, he took it to mean all the days of Jeroboam. And so beginning from the beginning of Jeroboam's reign all the way through came out to about 90 years. But that's not what's being said here, and it's been, I think, more accurately determined that he kind of came on the scene near the end of Jeroboam's reign and then reigned through these other kings as well. But some of these kings had pretty short reigns. But he only mentions the one king, even though he prophesied during the reign of these other kings. And again, I don't want to get into too much detail because we talked about it last time. But Zechariah only reigned 6 months, and we're going to talk about Jehu and the why Jehu is important here, but we're going to talk about that here in a few more verses because Jehu comes up in this particular chapter here. And you wonder, well, what is that name? Where does that come from? Well, Jehu was the father of Jeroboam. And God had, or actually the father of 2 kings prior to Jeroboam. And so the great-grandfather of Jeroboam and the great-great-grandfather of Zechariah. But when Jeroboam ruled Israel, he did something, and God rewarded him by promising him 4 successors in his line to the throne, that 4 of his seed will rule over Israel. And that seed ended with Zechariah. So it's kind of postulated that he mentions Jeroboam here in verse 1, but why didn't he mention these other kings? Well, Zechariah only served like 6 months. He was only king for like 6 months. Very short reign, very uneventful. He was an evil king, just as his father was. And he was assassinated pretty quickly by Shallum, who became king after him. And none of the other kings are mentioned here because they were not ordained by God. God did ordain Zechariah, but I think God cut his life short because Jeroboam was an evil king. And so God ended that reign of Zechariah because of his father's evil rule and his as well. And so he's not mentioned in here at all because of the short reign. But the other guys were not ordained by God, and we see that, and we looked at this last time. In chapter 8, verse 4, the Lord mentions these rogue kings that came on the scene after him. So that's where we're at here. We talked about Beri just briefly. He's not mentioned anywhere else in Scripture, so we don't really know anything of Hosea's life or his family or anything like that. So let's look at verse 2 and 3 real quick, and then we'll talk about, we'll just kind of review very quickly the issue of the wife, because these next chapters revolve around Hosea's wife. And so let's look at that. Verse 2. When the Lord first spoke through Hosea, the Lord said to Hosea, "Go, take to yourself a wife of harlotry and have children of harlotry, for the land commits flagrant harlotry, forsaking the Lord." So he, Hosea, went and took Gomer, the daughter of Diblaim, and she conceived and bore him a son. So last time we looked at these 4 possibilities of Hosea's wife, Gomer. Who was she? And some have postulated that she was a prostitute. Some have postulated, well, starting from the top, that this wasn't a real marriage, that God would never ask his prophet to do something so contrary to godliness as to go and marry one who was a harlot. Okay, so in other words, they start allegorizing it. Like, well, it didn't really happen. She wasn't really his wife. He's just making an analogy. And there is an analogy, but there's also this literal fulfillment that this did actually happen. There's no reason to not believe that this literally happened. And we talked about the reasons for that. I mean, if this is an allegory in a figure of speech, you wouldn't get into such detail about his wife and about the children and the names of the children and all of these things that go on here if it was just to be allegorized. But we came to the conclusion that it was to be a literal marriage. So that kind of took us down to those 2 choices. It was a literal marriage, but then who was Gomer? Was she a prostitute beforehand? Okay, or was she not a prostitute beforehand, but possibly just had a propensity toward unfaithfulness? Or that God commanded him to go get married, and this kind of goes along with the fourth one here, and that she was going to be a woman of harlotry. And that's the conclusion that we came up with, that she was not necessarily a prostitute before the marriage, but that the harlotry described here, when it says a wife of harlotry, was in reference really to her character. Okay, that she was probably chaste, but she had hang on here, gotta get my notes just right. She was probably chaste at the time, but had a promiscuous disposition potentially about her. But I think the better explanation, even better than that, is that this term wife of harlotry anticipates what she was proven out to be, and that was an unfaithful wife, a wife of harlotry. Okay, characterized, her life was characterized by unfaithfulness after her marriage to Hosea. Okay, and then you always have this issue, well, why would the Lord ask one of his prophets to do something so uncomfortable and utterly out of character? And I think that one of the things about this is that it's not really uncommon in Scripture. I put an example up here in Isaiah chapter 20, because this one always kind of makes me chuckle a little bit. So Isaiah chapter 20, the Lord said, even as my servant Isaiah has gone naked and barefoot for 3 years as a sign and symbol against Egypt and Cush. Okay? So was this to be taken allegorically? Was this just no. I mean, I think literally the Lord had Isaiah go naked and barefoot for 3 years, and that was to be a sign of this judgment that was to come. And I think it's the same with Hosea here, okay? God did not have concern over the comfort of his prophets. Let's put it that way, okay? You needed to be humble to be a prophet of God, okay? And look at what he's doing with Jonah right now as we get into the book of Jonah. Okay, I mean, Jonah was at the point where he would rather just die. Throw me overboard. Let me die, because the Lord was asking him to do something that was very uncomfortable for him. So this is not really out of character for the Lord. There's kind of another interesting one in Ezekiel chapter 4. The Lord asked Ezekiel to lay on one side, his right side, for 390 days. It's like, wait, what? Lay on your right side for? I mean, I can't even lay on my bed for like a half an hour on one side without getting sore. I mean, 390 days. That's over a year. He had to lay on one side to make a point that Judah had sinned against the Lord.
Well, contrary to the law, he was also supposed to cook his meals over a fire of dung. And he had to bargain with the Lord not to make his fires out of human dung.
Right, that's right. That's right, that was part of it. So anyway, we can look at these and we can see, we interpret Scripture with Scripture. So we can't look at what the Lord had Hosea do and say, oh, the Lord would never have him do it. So we got to come up with another allegorical meaning for what's going on here. We don't have to do that, okay? These things are very literal, and we can take it as such. Okay, looking at verses 2 and 3 again, when we look at that term harlotry, that term can also be, how do your guys' Bibles translate that? Does it use the term harlotry in there? I forgot to look at does it say wife of harlotry?
Yes.
Okay. I think there must be some translations that talk about adulteress, an adulterous wife, not a wife of harlotry. But I'm not sure why. But the term itself is translated, the same term is translated adulteress in other scriptures. And so I just wanted to show you some of that because the meaning is the same. It's talking about adultery, not prostitution. Adultery is when you're married and you're having relationships outside that marriage. Okay, so that kind of lends credence to the fact that we look at this as a literal interpretation, and that harlotry or that adultery took place after the marriage with Hosea. So I threw up on the board some of the verses here. The Hebrew term is zenunim, okay? And in these verses, what's interesting, and I'm using these verses in particular because I wanted to show you too that the context of this whole thing, and it goes in the next couple of chapters, is on the unfaithfulness that characterizes not just Hosea's wife, but the nation of Israel as well, because it's the same term used of her that's used of the nation of Israel. All of these verses that I have up on the slide here are referring to Israel, not to his wife. But there's an allusion here because he talks about Israel in female terms, because the point is that Israel is God's wife, and he is looking at Israel as being unfaithful, just as Hosea's wife is. So Hosea 2:2, and let her put away her harlotry from her face and her adultery from between her breasts. Same word, by the way, harlotry and adultery. Same word in the Hebrew. Hosea 2:4. Also, I will have no compassion on her children because they are children of harlotry. Well, guess what? He's talking about Israel, but we just saw that with with Gomer here, and Hosea. Hosea 4:12, my people consult their wooden idol, and their diviner's wand informs them, for a spirit of harlotry has led them astray, and they have played the harlot, departing from their God. Okay, and 5:4, their deeds will not allow them to return to their God, for a spirit of harlotry is within them, and they do not know the Lord. Okay, so again, the context is everything when we're looking at this, and we have to discern as we go, who is it that is being referred to here. So kind of another interesting thing here. In verse 2, it says, for the land commits flagrant harlotry. Well, is the land actually committing that? Or is that a figure of speech? Sometimes we have to understand these things are figures of speech. Not an allegory, but a figure of speech that is personifying the land as it relates to the nation of Israel. So in other words, the land represents all of the people of Israel in this case. Okay, so we see that it stands for the land. It's personified as this wife who is guilty of the worst harlotry. And I say that because of this term flagrant. The land commits flagrant harlotry. The word flagrant here in the Hebrew is emphatic, okay? And again, I had to get this out of a commentary. I'm not a Hebrew scholar or anything, but it talks about how emphatic it is that this is flagrant harlotry that they are committing. Thus, the judgment is just. This isn't just a little flirting on the side or something like that. This is flagrant, and this is bad. And Israel has departed to this flagrant extent and been unfaithful to the Lord.
Which verse was that?
In verse 2 still. Okay, when we're talking about the land commits flagrant harlotry. Okay, and then you see right after that, and have children of harlotry. Okay, in verse 2. So again, you kind of have the same thing here. The children are not harlots, but it's describing their being born in the context of the unfaithful Gomer. Now, these are true children of Hosea here. These weren't born out of her adultery. They were born of Hosea, I believe. But because they were born of one who is unfaithful, they are called children of harlotry. Okay, and again, these things commanded by the Lord. You're going to marry this woman, she will be unfaithful, and you will have children with her. Okay, these things had to be abhorrent to Hosea. It couldn't have been a very pleasant marriage for him by any means, and it shouldn't have been. But this is, again, analogous to or parallel with the Lord and his wife Israel, who has been unfaithful in their relationship, committing idolatry, which we spoke about this a little bit last week as well, and Tom has also spoken about this, the parallel between idolatry and adultery, or idolatry and unfaithfulness. We see it throughout Scripture. And so the Lord, when you look at this, even though no doubt Hosea's marriage could not have been pleasant by any means, it was a picture of how the Lord felt about his people, Israel. Okay? So then, verse 3, so he listens to the Lord, he obeys the Lord, and we find that with the prophets and all the prophets, despite how difficult these things are. Now, Jonah might be a bit of an exception here. He tried to resist those things, but you generally don't see that with the prophets. You know, they generally go and do what the Lord commands, because they have a keen understanding that this is the command of the Lord, and I'm going to do it. I am his messenger, and we see that with every prophet, despite the uncomfortable nature of some of the situations that the Lord puts them in. Okay, so he listens, and he goes in verse 3, and he marries Gomer, the daughter of Diblaim, and she bears him a son. Okay. So let's look at verse 4 and 5. We're going to start talking about the children now. Verse 4. And the Lord said to him, name him, this first son, Jezreel, for yet a little while, and I will punish the house of Jehu for the bloodshed of Jezreel, and I will put an end to the kingdom of the house of Israel, and it will come about on that day that I will break the bow of Israel in the valley of Jezreel. So it's like, whoa, okay, so this first son, through his unfaithful wife, the Lord commands him, name him Jezreel. Well, that's kind of an interesting name. What is the meaning of Jezreel? Well, the meaning of Jezreel is God scatters. Okay, well, why would you name my son that? God scatters. So there's significance to the name there of the fact that it means God scatters, but because we see what the end result of this judgment will be. But there's also significance to this place called Jezreel, this place where God is going to deal with Israel here. And this is how he deals with it. So he brings up these things. I will punish the house of Jehu. Well, what's the house of Jehu? Well, we just talked about that. That's the line of the throne of the northern kingdom. And so God had promised Jehu that his descendants would sit on the throne for 4 more generations. Okay, and we see that in 2 Kings chapter 10, verse 30, and chapter 15, verse 12. So why did he promise Jehu this? And there's a couple of interesting things. Jehu was also noted as being, do you think Jehu was noted as being a good king or an evil king? Yeah, well, why would God promise him 4 more generations to sit on the throne? Well, it's kind of interesting. Even an evil king did something right when he ruled. So in 2 Kings chapter 9 and chapter 10, you have this story, and this was the reason that that Jehu was rewarded, and it was in Jezreel where Jehu went and he massacred the house of Ahab. Okay, so he didn't just massacre the house of Ahab, but he also eradicated Baal out of Israel. And so he did a couple of good things. But the final line in his story in 2 Kings is that he did evil in the sight of the Lord. And it's like, oh, okay, so he might have done a couple of good things, but overall, he was seen as an evil king in God's sight. But because he did those things, the Lord had promised that his descendants would sit on the throne for 4 more generations. Okay, so that's what happened there. And the last of those descendants was Zechariah. And again, he had a very short reign on the throne. So in the future, and this is kind of interesting, this comes about in verse 5 where it says, it will come about on that day that I will break the bow of Israel in the valley of Jezreel, and that plays a part in the naming of this first child here. Well, it turns out that Israel's military was destroyed. So when we talk about Israel, we're talking about the northern kingdom's military was destroyed in Jezreel, which is a great valley in northern Israel. Their army was destroyed there. And that was fulfilled in about 734 BC. And this is when the Assyrians had come into Israel. Now they hadn't overtaken the capital yet and dispersed everybody, but they had already gone in to Israel and overtaken them and destroyed their military completely in 734 BC. And that's the bloodshed that we believe verse 5 is talking about, that I will break the bow of Israel. When you talk about the bow of Israel, you're talking about it's a military weapon, okay? So you're thinking, okay, so there's a military defeat of Israel that's going to happen in the valley of Jezreel, and that did happen in 734 BC. So we think that was the fulfillment of verse 5 there. And by the way, because of that, these other kings in Israel, these kings were appointed by the Assyrians. They were known as puppet kings. Okay, the last real king of Israel was Jeroboam, unless you count his son Zechariah, who didn't really do much in his very short term there. But these 5 kings that followed Zechariah were all puppet kings to the Assyrians. Okay, they had completely taken over Israel by that point, even prior to 722, when they finally dispersed the kingdom as a whole. All right, look at verse 6 and 7. It says, Then she conceived again and gave birth to a daughter. And the Lord said to Hosea, Name her Lo Ruhamah, for I will no longer have compassion on the house of Israel, that I should ever forgive them. But I will have compassion on the house of Judah. Oh, kind of interestingly enough. And deliver them by the Lord their God, and will not deliver them by the bow, sword, battle, horses, or horsemen. Okay, it's kind of an interesting couple of verses here. So Hosea's wife, Gomer, conceives again, and this time she has a daughter. And so the Lord said, well, name the daughter Lo Ruhamah. Okay, and so what does that mean? It means not loved or not compassionate. Okay, so in other words, this daughter is representing the Lord's relationship with his wife, with Israel. And the relationship with Israel is no longer one of love, no longer one of him having compassion, on them, it's time for judgment. Okay? So it really indicates that God's love for them is going to be cut off when this happens.
Look at the construction of that first sentence in verse 6 and also in verse 8. She gave birth to a daughter. Verse 8, she conceived and gave birth to a son. But it contrasts verse 3, where she conceived and bore him, Hosea, a son or a daughter, child.
So are you thinking
I'm
that,
thinking that's where she committed her harlotry or adultery, was in those two conceptions.
quite possible, Joan? I don't know. I still kind of stand by the fact that these were his children, because it's describing God's relationship with the nation of Israel. All of these kids do. Just as this would be Hosea's relationship with his unfaithful wife.
But it doesn't say, although the name is indicative of his feelings, it doesn't say he didn't acknowledge them as his children.
Well, that's true. I mean, you could very well be right on that, Joan. I'm kind of going with my gut feeling on this one.
Okay.
I think that they're all his children, and I think that just makes it more abhorrent for him as the husband. That God commanded him, to bear children with her. And I just think that these children that are born is just reflective of that relationship, of the feelings he has for her, as this is happening. But I can see your point. I can see how this could be, because the language is different with the other two. I don't know why that is, but maybe that's why. We can.
For right now.
I'll put a dollar. I'll put a dollar on it, and we'll see what happens.
I got a question, Larry.
Yes.
And I know that various people are divided on this, but did God ever divorce Israel and then remarry, or did he never divorce Israel?
I think on the basis of this book, it seems as though he did. He had the nation of Israel, both sides, north and south, dispersed. They were both judged and cast out. And there seems to be that analogy. But is there a strict divorce in here in a legal setting? Is that what you're asking?
Well, I just know that, I don't know exactly what I'm asking there, but I do know that in covenant theology, the idea is that he divorced Israel and left it there.
Oh, and that's why we have taken over.
That's why we pick up the pieces and go forward, because he divorced Israel.
Well, there's also that passage in Ezekiel where he's talking about Aholah and Aholibah.
The two sisters.
Mm-hmm.
Uh-huh.
And he discusses the pain of his relationship with him, but there's restoration there. And there's restoration here in Hosea. So I don't see him finally divorcing, casting out, judging, yes, but not severing the relationship for all time.
Well, if he did, then we would have to believe that he remarried her.
Well, definitely not for all time, because even after this, and we'll see here in a couple of verses, he speaks of a future, reconciliation or restoration with Israel. But his love for her has definitely been cut off, and we're about to see that right here. And we know that she has been cut off from Romans chapter 11, for instance, that she has been cut off for a time.
Yeah.
But we certainly haven't replaced her because we are not the wife of God. And so that's an issue. But yeah, I would tend to agree this is not necessarily a divorce, but probably more of a separation for a time.
And that's kind of what I see in chapter 2, verses 14 through 16.
Of Hosea?
Yeah, where he says, behold, therefore, behold, I will allure her and bring her into the wilderness and speak kindly to her. And
Yeah,
he
he's
says,
speaking to that future restoration
You
there.
will call me Ishi. You will no longer call me Baali, which means you'll call me husband rather than master. So
So not a divorce.
I don't see that. I don't remember any other scriptures that would indicate that he did.
Well, of course, the law did permit, not to belabor this point, not to delay your class, but the law did permit a man to divorce his wife for adultery. So that would give
Well,
God the permission or the right to divorce an adulterous wife of Israel. But I don't know if it ever says one way or the other. Maybe there's no verse that says, I divorce thee.
Yeah, there's nothing legal in there. But it seems more like a.
Hosea divorced Gomer?
Well, we're about to find out. Well, soon enough. Don't get ahead of me here, Dan. So just real quickly, Exodus chapter 34 uses the same term, Ruhama, describing, which is the name of the daughter here, and it's used for this term in Exodus 34, which is translated compassionate. And this term is speaking of or describing a very tender compassion that one would have a husband to a wife or a parent to a child. So it's speaking of that kind of compassion. So when the Lord names this kid Lo Ruhama, it means, I'm sorry, not Ruhama. Yeah, Ruhama. It is talking about no compassion or no love. Okay? And then we're going to see the same thing in the next verse. Well, let's look at what verse was I on there? Oh, that was verse 6 and 7. Okay, yeah, in verse 7, just really quickly, I will have compassion on the house of Judah. Okay, when did he have compassion on the house of Judah? Yeah, during Hezekiah's time. And it's interesting here, and again, this is prophesied because this happened many years. This took place, or this prophecy took place probably 40 years before the Assyrians went into Judah and the Lord delivered them. But it says here that God will not deliver them by bows. It won't be by military, sword, battle horses, or horsemen. But how did he deliver them in that instance? Mice. That's right. Oh boy, why do I?
By the might of his power. And if you want to say by the might of his power, let's just laugh.
So you can read about that in 2 Kings chapter 19. We won't go there today, but let's keep moving here. Verse 8. When she had weaned Lo Ruhama, she conceived then and gave birth to a son. And the Lord said, name him Lo Ami, for you are not my people, and I am not your God. Okay? So is this almost a divorce paper here? I don't know. It seems as though the relationship has certainly been severed at this point. So, So as soon as Lo Ruhamah is weaned, Hosea's wife again, she conceives, and the son's name is Lo-Ammi, which means not my people. And at this point in history, however, God is declaring that they are no longer his people. That relationship seems to have been severed at this point. And again, how does that relate to divorce officially or legally? I'm not sure. I certainly wouldn't be on board, with those who might hold to that and that somehow we replace them. But it seems as though that relationship has certainly ended at this point. They are no longer his people. And you can say that because you look at God's pronouncements of his people when they were married and the relationship was good to an extent. And look at these verses here, Leviticus 26:12. I will walk among you and be your God, and you shall be my people. Exodus chapter 6, and I will take you for my people, and I will be your God. And you shall know that I am the Lord your God, who brought you out from under the burdens of the Egyptians. Deuteronomy 26. You have today declared the Lord to be your God, and that you would walk in his ways and keep his statutes, his commandments and his ordinances, and listen to his voice. The Lord has today declared you to be his people, a treasured possession, as he promised you, and that you should keep all his commandments. Okay, there you can see the relationship that the Lord had with his people there. That has ended at this point with Hosea's pronouncements here.
Well, look at Christ. When he said, you are an adulterous generation, he was speaking to a specific generation of Israel. And I think he's speaking to a specific generation or two of Israel here. I don't believe that the Lord can abrogate his promises.
Oh, he doesn't abrogate his promises,
And
but he has cut them off
therefore,
like...
I don't think he divorces.
Well, Romans 11 says that they have been cut off for a time. Okay? So obviously the restorative part has always been in play, will always be in play, because he made that promise to Abraham, many centuries prior to this. So yeah, if you think of it as a divorce, there was a reconciliation afterwards, okay? And you have some things going on that make it seem like it wouldn't be like a permanent divorce for sure, because you can't get around the promises of God. So whether you call it a divorce, a separation, these are, I don't know, but they have certainly been cut off. That relationship has ended. The love is gone. The relationship is gone. They are no longer people of God. So however you want to look at that, I suppose.
I know it's commentary, but Ryer's comments on this, can I just read that real quick?
Yeah, fire.
So Hosea married Gomer only to discover that she was unfaithful. Though separation followed, Hosea's love, like God's love for his people, persisted, and reconciliation eventually ensued. And so I don't know, I would see it more as a separation, not a permanent divorce, and then remarry.
Sure. Well, we know it's not a permanent divorce. I mean, we know that, being the good dispensationalists we are, right? And you can't reconcile that with the rest of Scripture. You just can't. And you can't even reconcile it with this Scripture, because God's about to go in to the restorative aspect of their relationship and let them know that this cutting off is not going to be permanent. Why? Because number one, there's always a remnant, and number two, well, really, the number one reason is because he has promised these things, 15 centuries prior to this event, and God is not one to forsake his promises. Okay, look at verse 10 and 11. Yet the number of the sons of Israel will be like the sand of the sea. What does that sound like? Which cannot be measured or numbered, and it will come about that in that place where it is said to them, you are not my people, it will be said to them, you are the sons of the living God. And the sons of Judah and the sons of Israel will be gathered together, and they will appoint for themselves one leader, and they will go up from the land, for great will be the day of Jezreel. Okay, this is a remarkable shift when you look at, what's going on with the children of Hosea. Then suddenly we have a complete turn here of the Lord, and we see God declaring that the effects of this judgment is going to someday be completely reversed, and that there's going to be this time of blessing. And it's not just that. He promises all kinds of things here. He promises numerical growth. He says the number of the sons of Israel will be like the sand of the sea. Well, they're about to be decimated. They're about to be destroyed. The Lord has already let them know that. But yet, hey, guys, your numbers will be like the sand of the seashore. There's going to be numerical growth. There's going to be a spiritual restoration, a numerical restoration, a national unification. Okay? He talks about Israel and Judah being united again under one leader. And they're going to occupy the land. All of these things are going to happen. What's interesting is after the Assyrians go in there in 722 BC, and the people are, many are killed, destroyed. Much of the nation is destroyed, but the rest are dispersed from that point on, and they haven't reappeared since. It's like, where are those 10 tribes of Israel? We hear little phrases, the missing tribes of Israel and stuff. Well, that's real. Those 10 tribes were dispersed, never to return to the land. Unlike Judah, okay, who was also dispersed, but the Lord had granted them a way to return to the land, as we are about to see under Cyrus. But that didn't happen with the northern kingdom. But yet, someday they will be united with Judah and the rest of the nation. And God knows who his people are. And he's going to unite them somehow, some way. And it's going to be a really fascinating time when all that restoration happens. Okay, but here's some verses here. Genesis chapter 22, again, coming out of the Abrahamic covenant. Again, I will greatly bless you. I will greatly multiply your seed as the stars of the heaven and the sand which is on the seashore. And your seed shall possess the gate of their enemies. Genesis 32, for you said, I will surely prosper you and make your descendants as the sand of the sea, which is too great to be numbered. Okay? And we'll see it here in Hosea 3, verse 5. Afterwards, the sons of Israel will return and seek the Lord their God and David their king. Has that happened yet? Okay, this is what, over 3,000 years ago, and it still hasn't happened yet. Okay.
Because the end of that verse said, in the last days.
Right. So you're talking about the end of which verse? In Hosea chapter 3, right?
Yeah, they will come trembling to the Lord and to his goodness in the last days.
Right, in the last days.
Which are the days of Jacob's trouble.
Right. And I'm not going to go through all of this, but all of this is really a fulfillment of this new covenant. We talk about how we are saved on the basis of the new covenant, or the basis of the Abrahamic. The new covenant is really nothing but an offshoot of the Abrahamic covenant. Same with the Palestinian covenant, same with the Davidic covenant. All of those flow out of the covenant that God gave to Abraham. And this new covenant, and I'll let you guys read it. I have it up on the board, and it's actually on a few slides. But that is a fulfillment of all of these things that we see in verses 10 and 11. And it's the same covenant by which we have been grafted into. Okay? And when we celebrate the Lord's Supper once a month up there, what is it that this cup represents that we partake of? Yeah, it is this is the cup of the new covenant in my blood. And that's the exact same covenant that Israel is saved under as well, where all of these things will be restored. So this pattern that we just saw in chapter 1, the judgment, the covenant, all of that, we're going to see this pattern again and again, but it actually ends in chapter 2, verse 1. So let's read that really quick. Say to your brothers, Ami, and to your sisters, Ruhamah. Okay? What did we just learn about Lo Ami? What does that mean? Not my people. Well, they will be saying, my people now, or he will be saying, my people. What about the sisters? Ruhamah. What was Lo Ruhamah? Not loved. Okay, now they will be loved. Okay, so chapter 2, verse 1 is just a characteristic of that restoration period. They will now be loved by God, and they will be his people once again. Okay? All right, guys, we're going to pick up in chapter 2, verse 2 next week. Thank you. Any other questions, comments?
The back and forth was judgment and restoration. Is that
Judgment and restoration. I think in my slide it talked about judgment and salvation.